the end result, you're going to have to both perform on both the investigative side and the breaking news side. The problem is, generically speaking, some papers are getting into a generic market where news information comes from major news sources that are published in local or national news is fed to the local markets, and that's produced, but it's not something that is necessarily attractive where people are going to purchase into those local newspapers. It's just generic production. I know of one story that was produced by the Herald, not by the Globe, and that was more or less a breaking news business topic, and the other topics such as investigating reporter, I don't see that, and that's probably falling into the progressive side of something. So my question is, how does the Globe continue, how would they address issues like that and in order to stay competitive in the business place, in the business marketplace? Even if you go online, you're going to have to still do something to attract the buyers and the audience that you need to stay in the marketplace.
I have to believe that there's still a demand for quality journalism, quality information, and verifiable information that, the kind of journalism that traditional newspapers practice, whether it's online or in print, in hard copy, that there is a demand for that people will pay for it. I think that, just to loop around a minute to the previous question, the reason that the journalism model that's being practiced here at Northeastern, with the students helping to do the legwork on these tough stories and then getting them published in a legitimate newspaper like the Globe, the reason that works is because of Walter Robinson, who is an extraordinary journalist and a veteran, who has all of this legacy of knowledge, education, knowing where things, where the bodies are buried, sometimes literally, and knowing where the paperwork bodies are buried. And the thing I'm concerned about, and journalism schools have a big role to play here, is carrying on that legacy. And without there being newspapers, with editors like Robbie to help journalists practice that, this craft, with very specific rules. Without having those outlets, I do worry about the next generation of journalists.
Yeah, this goes back to what we were talking about before, when we were talking about online versus print, and one of the challenges online is figuring out how to make enough money to support a newsroom that can do hard-hitting investigative reporting, that can do really original stuff that you can't find in other places.
Can you comment on Global Post, which has been started in Boston? You're talking about all of the international bureaus that have been closed. Other than the BBC, then where else, other than a format like Global Post, and what do you see as its viability?
For those of you who don't know the Global Post, it was started by a former Globe reporter and a former Boston television news director, and it's a private profit-making business, they hope. And they have reporters scattered in 90 countries around the world. Some of them are not very experienced reporters, some are very experienced. But the idea is that they are an alternative worldwide news gathering source. And I'm having lunch with the people who run it tomorrow because Time Incorporated, which now has 8 bureaus instead of 55, is interested in making an arrangement whereby they would be the news network. They're already the worldwide news network for CBS. They're in negotiation with the Lair News Hour. It's sort of a replacement for this is something we really need to worry about, the perhaps dying Associated Press. Associated Press is owned by its member newspapers, and a lot of newspapers, they don't feel they can pay the money to carry it any longer. So Global Post becomes important, and other things like Global Post.
Hi. One thing that hasn't come up here, most of the discussion today has been like internet versus newspaper. And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit, we flirted with it a little, but television's role in all this too. Renee, you hit on it a little bit about this kind of focusing on media sources that speak to a perspective that you already have. You see that a lot in television now, and there's a lot of popularity in that. For the most part, TV, in particular cable news, is trash. I mean, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, it's not really news, it's more perspective, just pushing it. I would like to hear some perspective on that, because it's just not the internet as the boogeyman against the newspaper. It's a whole cultural thing, I think, about how you get information on like a 24/7 cycle. The strength of newspapers is obviously to percolate and have this story that you're building over time, but there is this kind of I want it now, I want it now, I want it now, and then you turn on CNN or Fox or whatever, and there's news constantly going, news in the loose sense, I mean, like the Tiger Woods thing, all that nonsense. But still at that, I mean, it's not just internet versus newspaper, there's other forms of media that are out there too that I think are changing the dynamic. I would just like to see you guys talk about that some.
You first? Okay. You know, I've never worked in television, so, you know, I'm not sure how smart this will be, but I do know that television is in worse shape than newspapers. I mean, as bad as things are in newspapers, you know, local TV networks are in very bad shape. You can tell that they're already cheapening the product. As you say, even cable, you know, for pay. Networks spend a lot of their budgets on, you know, opinion, which is cheaper than going out and having a bureau or having somebody in Baghdad or, you know, actually trying to do investigative reporting. There is some little bit of it that's still done in local television, but not much. And then reality TV, which is basically free. You don't have to pay anybody. You don't have to pay, you know, any labor costs at all. People will, you know, basically pay you to be able to, you know, break the law and be on television. I think that, you know, I don't know what I'm saying here except that to echo your concerns about, you know, a sort of cheapening of the product on television as well, and a kind of lowest common denominator effect that this has on media generally. You know, it's just a kind of general decline in quality on television that I see. And I think it does, you know, lower people's expectations about what quality journalism and quality media should be.
I think one of the questions raised by the rise of Fox and MSNBC is that, you know, in print and to a lesser extent in TV also, we've always been built by the idea of presenting stories with opposing points of view and different perspectives and that. And that's one of the things that you're really seeing going away. One of the things that's happening now is that people want news from the perspective they already bring to it, which I personally find to be pretty disheartening. I'm not a big fan of the rise of liberal TV versus conservative TV, and that this is what television journalism is going to be. And we're seeing that happening at lightning speed now.
Here, and the same thing on the net. I mean, people, I don't understand why people want to read something that they already agree with. Why bother to read it? I mean, you're already there. But it does seem to be the way that our media culture is arraying itself these days. Television, we were talking about this the other night, all of the Boston television stations used to have a State House reporter, right? At least one. And now the three together have one reporter left, I believe. It's not looking very big there either.
I'm a master's student here studying urban regional policy, and I found myself reading up on healthcare legislation and debate, and then the following morning I found myself watching regional news personalities on a PBS Sunday morning show talking about healthcare. And it's obviously a really complicated issue with a lot of implications, but I felt that none of them knew in the least bit what they were talking about. And I don't know if that's fair to say, but I guess my question is maybe more about kind of larger policy issues that have a lot of attention in the media, but oftentimes you find that they're not really talking about any of the implications for our region, for our city, for working people, for this, for that. It's more it's maybe a little glamorized, and I was wondering if that has to do maybe with the elimination of individual bureaus, and a problem maybe with having one bureau that all the outlets share when you're talking about such large issues. And I don't know if that's fair to say, but for these larger policy issues, it's frustrating to feel that people are, fighting things that are for their best interest or don't know what they're talking about, and I feel like we're fed it. So much so that I don't really pay any attention at all to the media on some of these issues. Although, the investigative journalism that you're talking about is something that I think is something that the local media should be proud of and should continue to do.
Well, in addition to all the other declines of foreign bureaus and, just staff in general, you've seen the decline of beats. The beat system, which, newspapers followed and even TV stations when they had, more staff followed for generations, allowed somebody to specialize in healthcare or in education or in crime or whatever, and to develop sources and to, really get educated so that people did know what they were talking about when they were writing stories about a healthcare bill or something that's complicated. On television particularly, it's easier to talk about the politics of an issue like healthcare, like who's up, who's down, is it going to win, is it going to get the votes, and the sort of sexy issues like, death panels or whatever. It's just easier to talk about that stuff than it is to delve into the really complicated, financial and medical and, process issues that bore a lot of people too. It's a combination, I think, of a lack of resources that are going into these reporters' jobs and the sort of sense that, well, we have to, entertain our viewers or our readers, and they don't really want to know all this really dull, programmatic issue stuff, which I think is misguided view.
I agree with everything Renee just said.
Even in its heyday, whatever you want to think of it as, in the 70s or whatever, television was never good at issues like healthcare. It's too complicated. There are no pictures, which is part of the problem. And it's just too convoluted to distill into 90 seconds, which is an eternity on television, or 34 seconds. So it's just not something television has ever been great at, I would say.
Yeah, but it does also relate to the audience, and the audience does have responsibility for it, and I think that most 9 out of 10 news organizations, if they had to have a really smart health reporter, or somebody who could tell whether Tiger Woods' wife had a 2-iron or 1-iron, they would hire the second one, I'm afraid.
I just follow up and say, the idea that Walter Cronkite came out and said we can't win Vietnam when he went and visited there, what happened to somebody taking a statement like that and thinking about what's best for everybody and saying something about it? I just can't imagine anyone doing that today.
Keith Olbermann does that every night.
Right. We don't have Walter Cronkite anymore. The 3 network news broadcasts combined have really, it's a fraction of what the audience was, and everybody who watches is over 70 years old, as you can tell from the advertising.
I want to take one more question, and then I have a very special question of my own. What? Oh no.
I want to go back to this issue of civic glue that both Renee and I talked about in our opening remarks. This idea that a public good arises from the leadership of the community reading a high-quality newspaper every day, and all this. Adrian and Dan, you seem optimistic about the ability to, we're clever and ingenious enough as human beings to reconstitute those in pain for high-quality journalism. Are we also clever enough to reconstitute that kind of shared experience? Because I don't see that in anything that's yet been described.
I know that I'm not clever enough. One of the things that we have to see is that everything good comes with a contrary bad, and the access that we have, everybody can have access to all the news in the world from a laptop, sitting in your pajamas, if you wish. The control and choice, the opportunity to go anywhere. This is something that didn't exist in the era of the large institutional media that dominated a place. That's something that I don't think our atomized society can recreate. I don't know how. It's a very sad thing.
What I'd like to do in the last few minutes we have is actually, Dan doesn't even know I'm going to ask him this, because we're not going to have Dan back this semester, but Dan has been doing an incredible thing in our old hometown. And that is, he got Time Magazine to spend what will be a year in the city of Detroit covering that city as it goes through pretty terrible times. And I wonder, Dan, because this is, of course, on the 21st century city, and I think pretty much everybody who's been here knows I'm from Detroit, like you. If you could tell us just a little bit about how Time Magazine decided to do it, what they're doing, and what you hope will come from that.
Well, first of all, I want to not take credit for it, partly because the parents-in-law of the person who really gets credit for it are sitting here tonight, and I don't want them to go and tell their son-in-law that I've stolen it from him. I was involved in the idea, but it really began with Rick Tetzelli, who is a longtime editor at 3 of the different Time magazines. What we've done collectively, though, we bought a house in the city of Detroit, and believe me, you want to buy a nice house, cheap, go to Detroit. We have a 6-bedroom house built in 1920 in a really nice neighborhood in fine condition that we bought for $99,000. And we're going to live there. We have reporters living there, and that's part of the story. What will we sell it for a year from now? If we've sold it for more, then maybe something good has happened in Detroit. But the idea is to do what the national media do too rarely with stories that aren't based in New York or Washington, which is to get into it and stay with it, to not do the helicoptering in, show a couple of shocking pictures and then move along, to actually take a stake in a story. And it happened in Detroit, Barry, not because you're from Detroit or I'm from Detroit. It happened there because John Huey, the editor-in-chief of Time Incorporated, went out to talk to the CEOs of what we used to call the big 3, now the kind of little-ish 3, and it was a sort of advertising and goodwill call. And as he drove from one auto company to another, he saw that city and the state it was in, and he came back and he said, "We're journalists. We have to do something about this." And I can tell you that at Time Inc., there were 250 journalists fired in the last 2 weeks. There's been another clearing out there. The opportunity to do something ambitious, important, and something that lifts the spirit of the journalists who work there doesn't come along very often. And I think that, as much as anything, is the good that's coming out of this project. Thank you for asking.
I want to thank our 3 guests for an absolutely extraordinary conversation this evening about one of the most important issues we face. One of the most magnificent things about this country has been its free press and its ability to criticize, and as a result of criticizing, change this country for the better. In fact, when it doesn't do that, as it sometimes doesn't, we see the sorry consequences of it. I was thrilled, in response to Robin's question, that this morning I was listening to NPR as I came to work, and one of the interviews was with Andrew Bacevich, who is a political scientist at BU, who's a scholar of Iraq. In fact, his son died as a soldier in Iraq. And he was criticizing the president this morning for his sending 30,000 troops, additional troops to Afghanistan. And his point wasn't that 30,000 troops shouldn't go to Afghanistan. He was saying that we have a complete wrong idea of what we're trying to do. He was suggesting in his comments, from a point of great knowledge, that we don't understand that this is not an enemy that is in a single country, that this is a network that goes across countries. And the analogy used was quite fascinating. He said, if we were to do the same thing in terms of presidential assassinations, what we would do, of course, is send our troops to Texas, to the book depository, because that was the last place where a president was assassinated from. And he suggested if we were to forget about Afghanistan as one place where terrorism is bred, but really think about the network and how you would develop a strategy for attacking it, we would be in much better shape. It is that kind of journalist who went out to find Andrew this morning and to ask him that question that we need a whole lot more of. The other thing I want to close with is that Steve Burgard and I have been talking for a year or more, we're both deans here, about how we bring journalism and public policy together. As an economist, I've been frustrated until quite recently about the way economics is covered in the press, both in the print and in television and sometimes in the internet. As a labor economist, I was always concerned that the press always just reported one unemployment number, when in fact we now know that there are many ways of thinking about unemployment. We have a 10.2% official unemployment rate, but if you really want to know what the real unemployment rate is, including those people who are underemployed, it's about 17.6%, or 1 in 6 Americans. That is finally starting to come out, but I do remember having a conversation, not with somebody from the Globe, but I believe from the Herald, and when I mentioned you really have to have more than just the unemployment number, the reporter turned to me, who had great experience, and said, well, I would like to put more numbers in, but my editor tells me that this will just bore people and they can't stand having more than one number an article. It shocked me because I always read the sports page first. And the sports page is filled with numbers. And then I go to the business page where there are billions of numbers. But the front page apparently can't have more than one. So one of the things that I hope you'll remember is that this, of all the things we've talked about this semester, and all the things that are important for making cities wonderful places to live for all of us who want to live in them, is that the newspaper, journalism, plays such a critical role in making sure that the society we have can be the best it can by often figuring out what the worst is in it. So I want to thank all of you for being here. Renee, Adrian, Dan. Have a wonderful evening. Next week is our last class. We will be talking about the role of anchor institutions. While we will unfortunately not be able to have our mayor, who was originally going to be here because of his recent injury, we will have a stellar cast of speakers. We look forward to seeing you here next week. Thank you very much.